I remember a time early in my career when every paycheck felt like a reset button. I'd get paid, I'd pay rent, cover groceries, maybe put a little aside, and then somehow, by the end of the month, I was back at zero again. Not broke in a dramatic way, just stuck in that cycle where money comes in and disappears almost quietly. And what made it more frustrating was that my income was actually going up, but my life didn't feel like it was changing in the same way. There's something strange about money that most people don't talk about. It doesn't improve your life in a straight line. It moves in stages. You can earn a little more and still feel exactly the same, almost like nothing changed at all. And then suddenly, at certain points, everything feels different. Not just your bank account, but how you think, how you plan, even how you breathe financially. And one of those points, the one almost nobody pays attention to, is around $75,000. Not because it's magical, but because something subtle shifts there. In your decisions, your stress levels, your ability to think long term. So the real question is this: why does $75,000 feel like a turning point for so many people, even when they don't realize it's happening? I am Humphrey, as you know. Over time, one of the things you start noticing, especially if you spend enough time around personal finance conversations, is that people don't struggle in random ways. There are patterns, very predictable ones. I've seen it with people just starting their careers, I've seen it with people making solid middle-class incomes, and I've seen it even later on when they're technically earning good money, but still feel financially stuck. The details change, but the behavior underneath it stays surprisingly consistent. At lower income levels, most of the focus is survival-based, paying bills on time, avoiding overdraft fees, trying to build even a small buffer. Then, as income rises, something interesting happens. The stress doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. It becomes more about confusion. I make more, so why doesn't it feel like more? And this is where mid-income thresholds become really important. There's a range, somewhere between roughly $60 and $90K, where I've seen people repeatedly hit a kind of psychological plateau. Not because the money isn't enough, but because their financial system hasn't evolved fast enough to match their income. It's not about intelligence or discipline. In fact, some of the most disciplined people get stuck here the longest because they keep doing what worked at lower income levels, even when the game has already changed. And when you watch enough of these transitions happen, you start realizing something simple but important. Income doesn't just change your wallet. It changes your relationship with decision making. And around that mid-income range, that relationship starts to shift in a very noticeable way. This is the part most people don't really talk about, but a lot of viewers will probably recognize themselves in it. There's this strange in-between phase financially where you're not really struggling anymore, but you're also not where you thought you'd be by now. You're paying your bills on time, you're not worried about surviving the month, but at the same time, you don't feel ahead either. It just feels like you're maintaining life instead of actually building something bigger. And the confusing part is the income increase. Because on paper, things are better. Maybe you got a raise, maybe you switched jobs, maybe your career finally started moving. But emotionally, it doesn't land the way you expected it to. The stress doesn't disappear, it just shifts. Instead of, can I afford this? It becomes, why doesn't this feel like enough yet? Then there's everything around it. Small lifestyle upgrades that don't feel like luxuries, but slowly become normal. Slightly better food, a nicer place, more subscriptions, more convenience spending. Nothing dramatic, just enough to absorb the extra income without you noticing it happening. And underneath all of that, there's this quiet pressure too. The feeling that you should be further ahead by now, even if logically you know you're doing fine. It creates this odd gap between what your life looks like and what it feels like financially. What's interesting about that 75K range is that it's not really about the number itself. It's more about what tends to happen to people's behavior around that level of income. And you can usually break it down into 3 shifts that quietly change everything over time. The first is what I'd call the survival shift. Before this point, money tends to feel reactive. You're not really planning far ahead in a structured way. You're responding to what shows up. A bill comes in, you pay it. An unexpected expense hits, you adjust. Even if you're doing fine, there's still a sense that money is something you're constantly managing in real time. There's not much breathing room, so most decisions are driven by urgency rather than intention. Then somewhere around this mid-income range, you start to see the structure shift. This is where people begin to step back slightly and say, okay, I need a system for this. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just finally tracking expenses more consistently or setting up automatic transfers to savings without overthinking it. But the key difference is that money stops being purely reactive. A small surplus starts showing up more regularly, even if it's not huge yet. And that surplus changes how you think. Because once there's even a little buffer, your decisions stop being purely about the immediate next expense. That opens the door to the third shift, which is the compounding shift. This is where things start to feel different long term. Savings don't just sit there anymore. They begin to accumulate. Maybe investing enters the picture, even in a simple way. And more importantly, your mindset shifts from short-term problem solving to long-term positioning. Stress slowly decreases, and that reduction in stress actually improves decision making, which then improves outcomes again. So what changes around $75,000 isn't magic. It's the transition from reactive money behavior to structured and then compounding behavior. A lot of people assume that wealth is just a function of income. Earn more, become wealthy. But in reality, it doesn't work that cleanly. Two people can earn the same amount of money and end up in completely different financial places, and the difference usually comes down to systems, not salary. This is where the idea of a financial transition point becomes useful. It simply means there are certain income ranges where your money behavior naturally starts to change. Not because you suddenly become smarter with money, but because your financial environment gives you more room to think differently. At lower income levels, there's very little margin. And margin is just the space between what comes in and what goes out. If money is like water flowing into a container, at lower levels, that container is almost full all the time. Every drop has a purpose. Nothing really accumulates. But as income rises, that container doesn't just get bigger. It starts to have space again. Even a small amount of empty space changes everything. Because now money isn't just rushing in and out. Some of it can sit. Some of it can be directed. That's where decisions start to matter more than raw income. And this is the key misunderstanding. Wealth doesn't come from how much water flows in. It comes from how much control you have over where it goes and how long it stays. This is why that $75,000 range ends up mattering more than people expect. It's not that something dramatic happens when you cross it, but your relationship with money starts to feel noticeably different if your structure is even slightly in place. At that point, financial anxiety usually doesn't disappear completely, but it becomes less constant. You're no longer thinking about every expense as a potential problem. There's a little more breathing room between income coming in and money going out, and that space changes how your mind reacts to financial decisions. Saving also starts to feel less forced. Instead of constantly deciding whether you can afford to save this month, it begins to happen more consistently in the background. Not because you suddenly become more disciplined, but because the system you've built has a bit more stability to work with. And investing, for a lot of people, becomes less intimidating. When there's even a small buffer, risk doesn't feel as overwhelming because you're not operating right on the edge anymore. That emotional distance from scarcity makes long-term thinking easier. The important part is this. If you never really step into this transition, if your income goes up but your structure doesn't change, then wealth building gets delayed without you realizing it. You stay busy managing money instead of actually positioning it. And that's why this isn't just about reaching a number. It's about recognizing when your financial behavior is ready to evolve and whether you're actually letting it. At this stage, the goal isn't to completely overhaul your life. It's to introduce structure where things are still a bit reactive. One of the simplest shifts is automation. Even if it starts small, setting up an automatic transfer the moment your paycheck hits can change your behavior over time. Not because the amount is huge, but because it removes the daily decision of whether to save or not. It just happens. Another helpful step is separating your money mentally and practically. When everything sits in one account, spending and saving compete with each other in real time. But when you split things into different buckets, even just a spending account and a long-term savings or investing account, it becomes easier to see what's actually available versus what's already committed. Then there's the idea of building a buffer mindset. This is really about consistency more than size. An emergency fund is part of it, but so is treating investing as something that doesn't get paused every time life feels slightly expensive. Even small, steady contributions matter more than occasional large ones. And probably one of the biggest traps to watch for here is lifestyle inflation. Because as income rises, it becomes very easy to upgrade things quietly without noticing the long-term impact. None of this has to be extreme. It's not about perfect discipline. It's about slowly building systems that make your money behave better than your emotions do in the moment. One of the most common things that happens around this income level is lifestyle inflation. It doesn't usually show up as one big decision. It's more subtle than that. A slightly nicer apartment, more convenient spending, better food, upgraded subscriptions. Individually, none of it feels irresponsible. But together, it quietly absorbs the extra income before it ever gets a chance to build anything meaningful. Another big mistake is waiting. Waiting to invest until you feel like you have enough. Waiting until income is higher, until life is more stable, until things feel less uncertain. The problem is that waiting often becomes a habit, and that habit tends to follow people even when they finally do earn more. There's also this idea that budgeting becomes less important as income increases, but what usually happens is the opposite. Without some level of awareness, spending naturally expands to fill whatever space is available. So the higher the income, the more dangerous it becomes to have no structure at all. And then there's emotional spending. When people finally feel a bit of financial relief, it's very common to reward themselves in ways that slowly undo the progress they just made. Not because they're careless, but because pressure finally eased and spending becomes a form of release. The pattern underneath all of this is simple. It's not that people fail because they don't earn enough. It's that their habits don't evolve at the same speed their income does. At this point, I want to turn this back to you for a second, because this is where the idea actually becomes real in your own life. Where are you sitting right now in this 75K conversation? Are you below it, approaching it, or already past it, but still feeling like nothing really changed in the way you expected? And more importantly, have you noticed any shift in how you handle money as your income changed? Not just the obvious stuff like earning more, but the subtle things, like how often you think about saving, or whether investing started feeling less intimidating, or even if spending decisions became a little more automatic over time. Most people don't notice the transition while it's happening. It only becomes clear when they look back and realize their financial behavior at 50K felt completely different from 80K, even if their lifestyle didn't change that dramatically. I'm also curious where you personally feel the biggest friction right now. Is it still budgeting and control, or is it more about trying to actually move into investing and long-term planning, but not feeling fully consistent yet? If you've gone through this shift already, what changed first for you? Your income, your mindset, or your habits? Because the interesting part is everyone's timeline looks slightly different, but the pattern underneath it tends to repeat. And hearing real experiences is usually where people start recognizing their own. If you zoom out from everything we've talked about, the main idea is actually pretty simple. That 75K mark isn't some finish line where life suddenly becomes financially easy. It's more like a transition point where the way you handle money starts to matter just as much, if not more, than the amount coming in. For some people, that shift happens a little earlier, for others a little later, but the pattern tends to show up in the same way. Before that point, money often feels like something you're reacting to. After that point, it starts becoming something you can actually shape. Not perfectly and not overnight, but gradually, through systems, habits, and small decisions that start to stack over time. And that's really the part most people miss. Financial progress isn't just mathematical, it's behavioral first. The income matters, of course, but the structure you build around that income is what determines whether it actually turns into stability, then growth, then real long-term freedom. When you understand what stage you're in, you stop trying to force the wrong strategy at the wrong time. You start making decisions that fit your current reality instead of your future expectations. And in the end, that awareness alone changes the direction you're moving in, even if nothing about your income changes immediately. If there's one way to think about all of this, it's that nothing about your financial life really changes from a single decision. It changes through repetition, structure, and time. So if you're sitting at this stage right now, whether you're approaching that 75K range or just trying to understand where your money is actually going, the most valuable thing you can do is keep learning how these patterns work in real life, not just on paper. You might find it useful to watch more conversations around how people build systems with their money, or how budgeting slowly turns into investing, and how those small behavioral shifts eventually start to compound in ways that aren't obvious at first. Because the truth is, financial growth doesn't really come from one breakthrough moment. It comes from understanding the stage you're in, making slightly better decisions within that stage, and letting time do the rest. And if anything, the goal isn't to rush ahead of where you are. It's to get clear about what actually moves you forward at this point in your journey, so the next step you take feels intentional instead of reactive.